is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. In today's review, we are going to be taking a look at the Focal Stellia. Now, before we get started, I have to give a big shout out to Bloom Audio for sending these out for review. Bloom is a online audio retailer. He has sent me a few other things for review before, including the Mr. Speakers Ether 2 and Campfire Andromeda. So big thanks to him for sending these out for me to review. I will link his store down in the description below for you to check out. But without further ado, on into today's review. So for a little bit of a change, I am going to actually go over the unboxing experience first, because I feel like that is a big part of what you are paying the $3,000 price point of these headphones. So these are $3,000, just to get that out of the way. And like I said, I feel like the unboxing experience is a large part of that $3,000 price tag. So with the Stellia, you get this giant leather box, this brown leather box. It says Focal and Stellia on the front. You have a few other things here of like different information and whatnot. So you take this part off without me hitting my camera. There we go. Put that off to the side. Now inside the box, it is like a velvet material. So inside you get a case, a little strap says Listen Beyond on the handle, and that is where the headphones are. And also inside here you get this leather booklet. So moving this out of the way. Okay, so these are the two things you get with the Stellia. So I guess let's see the headphones first. So inside this case with the little silver zippers with the little rubber protectors on it. So inside here you get the Stellia themselves in their little carrying case, which we will go over these in just a second. But inside the little booklet here, you get a, I believe, 6-foot balance cable, if I remember correctly. And no, sorry, this is a 10-foot cable. This is a 10-foot cable. And you also get a little leather booklet here with different information about like the beryllium drivers, warranty cards, all that. And also under here you get a 4-foot 3.5mm cable with a 1/4-inch adapter. I don't like either of these cables. These are basically the exact same cables as the Focal Lex, for those of you that saw my review. So they're like fabric covered, way too stiff, and I don't really like these cables, so I used my Periapt cable with these the whole time. I never even took these out of the box because I already know what these cables are and I know I don't like them. So I will link to Periapt in the description below for you who want to get a different cable for these or other headphones. Now, moving on into the Stellia themselves. So this is the Focal Stellia. And what this basically is the closed back version of the Focal Utopia. However, there are a couple differences that we need to go over here. So let's put this case off to the side here. We'll leave it just right there. So starting off with the build, the Focal Stellia is built basically just like all other, like the lower end Focal, like the Alere, the Allegia, the Clear, the Lex, basically the same. The only real difference is that there is leather here in the holes on the cups. So that's really the only distinguishing difference. Then obviously the copper kind of finished with the brown leather headband and brown leather pads. That is what distinguishes the Stellia from some of the lower end Focal models. But overall, that means basically the same build. The padding on the headband with like the leather, the metal yokes, and like this thing here with the metal, and then the cups are like plastic on the sides with the metal on the top, and this thing's metal. And then the standard Focal driver opening, although this one has a mesh over it, probably because it deals with beryllium, which is toxic if it gets airborne. Now with the Stellia, for this being their like flagship closed headphone, I wish that they would have done something more to distinguish it from the lower end models. Like the Utopia has, the carbon fiber and the little bit different cup design, which makes it stand out from the cheaper models. But the Stellia, being the flagship closed back model, doesn't really stand out from the lower end models. So I wish they would have done something a little bit more on the Stellia to try to distinguish it. Now moving on into the comfort. So the Stellia is fairly standard fare for focal comfort. It's a little bit heavier, but it is pretty comfortable for me. For long wear, it does kind of get to me on the top of my head a little bit, but your mileage is going to vary on that. Some people don't like this focal headband at all, which I totally understand because there's no strap, and it's going to depend on how it hits your head. But your mileage is going to vary on the comfort of this. But for me, not too bad. The pads are deep enough for me, but once again, if you have larger ears, might hit the inside of that. But mileage is going to vary, but for me, not too bad. Pretty standard fare for focal. And I guess now we should do the specs, doing it a little later than we usually do. So these are a $3,000 closed-back dynamic headphone with an impedance of 35 ohms, a 106 dB per milliwatt sensitivity with a frequency response of 5 to 40,000 hertz and a weight of 435 grams. So coming off of those specs, one thing that you will notice is that these are a 35 ohm impedance compared to the Utopia's 80 ohm impedance. And that means that they changed out the voice coil of the driver for a 35 ohm voice coil. And I really have to question why they did that. Now I understand why, but I don't also see why, which you'll see what I mean in just a second. So the Stellia is meant to be a portable headphone. Carrying case, 4-foot cable, closed back. They're targeting this for portable use. Now, the thing I have to question though is why did you need to make it easier to drive? The Utopia is very easy to drive. It's like 80 ohms at 104 dB per milliwatt, like really easy to drive. And I feel like anybody taking a $3,000 closed back headphone out and about probably has a portable player with enough power to push a Utopia, because Utopia does not need a lot of power to get up and going. Where the Stellia here is ridiculously easy to drive. One of the easiest to drive headphones I've ever used, like by a long shot. Even like stuff that's marketed as easy to drive, these are easier. Like X100s, everybody knows is easy to drive. These are easier to drive than X100s. Like these take no power at all. Like this is like one of the ones on like the 789 first gain balance is like 7 o'clock is like 0 and like 9 o'clock is like loud. So these take literally no power to drive, which is interesting. Okay, so now moving on into the sound area. So we are going to start things off with FR. However, before we talk about that, I have to mention that the Stellia is the most dependent headphone on seal I've ever seen. For whatever reason, with these pads, I wear glasses, and the glasses make such a large difference in the amount of bass. Like if you're wearing them with glasses and you pull off your glasses, just that tiny little bit of just like really thin frame, like here's my frames, really thin frames, you know, and that's really not too much of a problem with seal on really any other headphones that I use. But for whatever reason, on the Stellia, that's enough to really break the seal, and you get such a difference in the amount of bass with that. So if you're a glasses user, I would not recommend these because the seal is really going to break. However, that actually might be a good thing depending on how you want to look at it, which we'll see in just a second. So I have a feeling that a lot of people's impressions of the Stellia is going to be pretty different, like I mentioned with the Neumann and its positioning, because the seal on this is going to vary a lot depending on glasses, no glasses, people's head shapes, and that's really probably going to change people's opinions of this headphone and how it sounds. Now, listening to these with no glasses, it seems like there's a bass shelf, like a 200 hertz bass shelf of anywhere from like 3 to 5 dB. It's kind of hard to tell because, you know, like the positioning and the seal really matters, but there's a significant bass shelf there from like 20 to 200-ish hertz. So it's like a little bit of a bass shelf. After that, fairly standard fare. A little bit of like 1-2K recession, just a slight little bit you can hear in the sine sweep. And then after that, quite a significant drop off in your mids after around 3-ish K. Listening to sine sweep, you really can hear like after 2.5, 3K, it just drops right off. And by the time you get to like 6.5K during sine sweep, it almost sounds like it doesn't exist. Like it's so far down. it's just gone. It's so much quieter. It's down maybe like almost 10 dB. Like you can't even hear it barely. And then after that, it comes right back up at like 7K. So you have a little bit of like elevated treble, like 7, 8, 9, 10K. That area's a little bit elevated above where like your lower mids were. So these are, I mean, I guess you could call it a V shape. A little bit reset, a little bit or elevated bass with some elevated treble and a quite recessed mid-range. So I guess this would classify as a V-shaped headphone. Now, detail-wise, the Utopia is known as a very, very detailed dynamic headphone, arguably the most detailed dynamic headphone out there. And the Stellia is definitely behind the Utopia in terms of detail from my experience with it. Now, it seems whenever you take a driver that's, a harder to drive headphone and you make it easier to drive, the detail goes down. And you can see this with like the Bear DT880, where the 32 ohm has less detail than the 250 and the 250 is less than the 600 ohm. And this seems to be the same fare here. It's definitely less detailed than the Utopia is, which once again, it doesn't need to be because they didn't need to make this headphone easier to drive. Now, where this falls in detail, I would say this sits probably in the maybe 1500-ish mark of detail, like maybe HD 800, let's say probably a little less than HD 800, maybe more like LCX or Aria or something like that, and that like $1,000 maybe to $2,000 price range in terms of detail, but not quite there for $3,000 in my opinion, or not in like that $4,000 Utopia LC4 price range. So I'd say it's like $1,000 to $2,000 worth of detail. So as for dynamics, initially I thought the dynamics were fairly poor, but then I realized it was because I wasn't getting a seal. So once you get a seal, the dynamics are actually pretty good. They actually have a decent amount of impact, which I think probably the bass shelf helps with to some degree. But dynamics, I would say, are definitely acceptable, or amount of dynamics and within an acceptable range for the price point. Now, soundstage is actually really wide. This is probably one of the best stages I've heard in a closed back headphone. Definitely a very, very wide soundstage. Imaging was mostly good. I thought they sounded a little vague on center, but left and right were very, very accurate in the left and the right side, but just a little bit vague in center. And then as for timbre, very, very typical metallic focal timbre. Seems like all the focal headphones have that very, very metallic timbre. So overall, I would say that is the description of the sound on the Stellia. Decent amount of detail, pretty good dynamics, really good stage. Fair imaging with a vague center and a metallic timbre. Now moving on into comparisons. So the Focal Stellia, I think, really only has one competitor that I can think of, being the Sennheiser HD820S. And I really don't like the Sennheiser HD820S. The frequency response is really weird. It just sounds really, really off, like weird bass bloat with really weird mids and some real sharp treble peak that I remember hearing. And then like months later when Oratory measured it, I remember seeing like the peaks that I remember hearing. And I just really don't like the HD820 at all. Now, the Stellia, when I heard it at CanJam, I really didn't like it, but I think Focal was using really weird amps that were messing with stuff. And hearing it now at home, I like it a lot better than I did at CanJam. But it definitely still has limitations. So my favorite closed-back headphone that I've heard is the ZMF Icon. I really like the Icon. The Stellia is more detailed than the Icon, and I think is wider from memory. But this is, I would say, a little bit less normal of an FR. Or actually, the Stellia is a very, I would say, a mainstream tuned headphone, where the Icon, I think, is a little bit more sane. It's definitely warmer than this and more laid back, where this is, I would say, is a little more mainstream with a little more detail, and it's brighter. Now, that being said, the stuff that I really liked listening to on the Stellia was like very mainstream music, like EDM, hip-hop, rap, pop music. that kind of stuff sounded really good on the Stellia because it's that very consumer-oriented tuning, which I think is what they were going for with this, which is fair because, I mean, on the go, I think probably more people don't listen to, very, very audiophile tracks on the go. They listen to, real, quote-unquote, real music, being like more mainstream stuff. Not that audiophile stuff's not real music and vice versa, you know what I mean. But anyway, so yeah, these are going for a much more consumer-oriented tuning where the Icon, I think, is a little more of a normal, sane audiophile tuning, if that makes any sense. And then, as for closed backs, there's really not that much else in the expensive price point, unless you want to do IEMs, but, that's a pretty different market. We're not really going to compare full-size with IEMs. Now, the one thing I do have to question is why. How many people out there really want a $3,000 closed-back portable headphone? And portable is a loose term because, these are still large headphones. These aren't like a small on-ear. These are a full-size, large pair of headphones with a large carrying case. Like, there's my hand. I have pretty big hands, and that's a big carrying case. That would take up most of a backpack. And I know there are some, crazy audiophile setups out there. I've seen some crazy ones. But I feel like this is a very niche product. The amount of people that want a $3,000 closed-back portable headphone, I feel, is a very, very, very small market. And for those of you at home, I mean, most people at home don't need closed headphones. I mean, if you're living with somebody else, chances are you're younger, and most young people aren't going to be buying $3,000 closed-back headphones. So I guess maybe for office use. But like I said, this seems like a very, very niche product to me. There seems like a very small amount of people that would want this product. And frankly, I don't dig the looks of this whole pattern, like, what's that called? Trypophobia or whatever, that fear of holes. I feel like that would trigger those people quite a lot. But yeah, I don't dig this coppery hole look. I think this is too showy and too standoutish in public. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure there's somebody out there that likes this look and, would fall into that market. But it seems very, very niche and very limited market to me. But overall, the Stellia, I actually don't hate. I know that this headphone gets a lot of hate, and I initially did hate it at shows. But after hearing it at home, it sounds acceptable enough to me. And it gets my pass for a very, very, very select few people. But if you're asking this or a Utopia or an LCD4 or something open back, yeah, definitely take the open back because you should pretty much always take open over closed. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed my review of the Focal Stellia. Once again, big shout out to Bloom Audio for sending these out for review. I will have the link to his store down in the description below, as well as the ears graph, my Twitter, my contact email, and all other relevant information. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.